Welcome to Nature plus Justice plus Women's Leadership, a strategic trio for effective change. And so I'm going to describe to you the flow of our session. And while I do that, I want to invite everyone who's joining us to enter your names and where your feet touch the ground into the chat room. And as we do that, I want to invite us all, including the panelists, to take 2 deep breaths together for centering and attuning around the world in connection with each other. And on the second deep breath, as you exhale, feel free to release a sound to let any tension leave your body that may be sitting there. Deep breath in and out. And one more. And with a sound. So I have had a 30-year inquiry into 3 intersecting elements: the changing definitions of leadership, how gender affects leadership's altering landscape and relationships to power, and the rebalancing of the feminine and masculine archetypally, regardless of what gendered body you may be in our psyches, our cultures, and our institutions. And my devotion and love for the natural world, who I inwardly refer to as Mother Life, has been a lifelong passion for me. My commitment to justice has really emerged and grown over the past 20 years, although they've all become a braid of issues that I now see as inseparable. Ecofeminism was a term that was first coined in the early 1980s, which I'd understood as describing the nexus of women and nature. It's a combination that I understood from my body's own wisdom and cycles that organically attuned with the moons, and from my devotional sense of the sacred in nature. I also knew that there were clear parallels between the way that corporate capitalism has commodified nature, mining the earth for resources motivated solely by profit, just as 1/3 of the women on earth are being objectified, abused, abducted, or raped without concern for their humanity or for the damages inflicted. As I explored how leadership itself was changing, I realized that the experience of being in a female body, in a culture that has been so steeped in patriarchal values, offers women and girls an empathic window on all injustice. Now I'm seeing more deeply the compounded influences of all 4 systems and their inseparability of patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. Sylvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, reveals how the consolidation of a capitalist system was dependent upon 3 things: the subjugation of women, the enslavement of Black and Indigenous peoples, and the exploitation of colonized lands to extract resources. She details how the unpaid labor of women and of enslaved workers was a necessary foundation for capitalism to take root and spread widely. Now we face an immediate climate emergency with the extractive industry's lobbyists dominating the global negotiations with spin, denial, and distraction. And it's women who are leading a majority of the most effective stands globally for climate justice. The U.S. still has not ratified an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, and this country ranks 51st among the world's nations in gender equality. And while more women are being elected into political office, which proves to be healthier for people and planet, at the same time, more white women voted for Trump in the 2020 election than had voted for him in 2016. Some researchers believe gender bias is the deepest bias in the human psyche, deeper than race, class, or faith. But it may prove to be as deep a challenge for women as it is for men. Within the context of that braid of concerns and values, these three women with very diverse perspectives and backgrounds will join us to explore what their lived experience might bring to help illuminate how the combination of nature, women's leadership, and justice holds some of the greatest promise for our futures. They're going to speak to that in a moment, but let me give you a quick snapshot introduction first. Osprey Orielle Lake is founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International, also known as WECAN International. She works with grassroots and Indigenous leaders, policymakers, and scientists to promote climate justice, resilient communities, and a just transition to a democratized energy future. She also serves on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Osprey is joining us from COP26 in Glasgow, where she's leading a delegation, and she's the author of the award-winning book, Uprisings for the Earth, Reconnecting Culture with Nature. Osprey brings together a highly strategic and innovative mind with a deeply devotional heart to offer her wise perspectives and overview. Amisha Ghadiali is someone I first met as the host of the globally acclaimed podcast, The Future is Beautiful, now being reframed and renamed thefutures.earth. She is a facilitator, speaker, and writer based in the UK with extensive backgrounds in sustainable fashion, socially conscious entrepreneurship, activism, meditation, and yoga. She's led many retreats, workshops, and rituals around the world, and is recently the author of a book called and about intuition. I admire her as a woman of deep inner wisdom, guided by a profound quality of listening, reflection, and perceptual acuity, and spirit-informed learning. Naelyn Pike is a 22-year-old renowned Chiricahua Apache activist and lifelong fighter for Indigenous rights. She follows in the footsteps of her grandfather, who founded the Apache Stronghold to protect their people's sacred sites and rights. At age 13, Naelyn was the youngest Indigenous girl to testify before Congress. Today, she continues to battle corporations and political leaders whose actions damage the earth as she fights for environmental sustainability and Indigenous rights at the local, state, and national levels. I've found Naelyn to be a woman of great honesty, perseverance, and courage. So, in that order, I want to invite you each to take 5 or 6 minutes to reflect on the combination of nature, justice, and women's leadership, and to share why that combo is strategically important in your own experience. Osprey, thank you for starting us off.
It's truly an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Nina, and it's an honor to meet the two other panelists as well. Everything feels quite poignant now that I'm here at COP26. It's the last and final day. The negotiations are still going on for the climate talks. And so having this conversation right now feels particularly alive for me because we're seeing the opposite of women's leadership and the balance of justice and nature here. We're not seeing the upliftment of women as we need to, and the incredible role of women leaders in the climate justice movement is profound and necessary. And there's so many studies around the world that show us we can't even get to any kind of sustainability without girls and women and their input around issues of food security and food sovereignty and water programs and all the many, many solutions that we have, from agroecology to reforestation. So many of them are dependent on girls and women's leadership. So we're not seeing there being a lot of women in leadership roles here as much as they need to be during these very essential climate talks. And that goes across the board, not just during this period of time in governance structures around the world, because of the very thing that you mentioned, Nina, of these interlocking systems of colonization, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And I think it's really important to understand the historical context. And you brought up some of that when you talked about Caliban and the witch, and the way over a period of time that this imbalance has occurred, and this imbalance with nature, this imbalance with justice, this imbalance with women and the role of women's leadership in a balanced way. And I wanted to mention another book called Woman, Church, and State by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which also talks about how patriarchal religions really also are very important to our understanding as women are reclaiming their understanding of who they are, their identity as women, whether it's Indigenous women, Black women, brown women, white women, women from many different identities, as well as those across the gender spectrum, is to really understand the roots of patriarchy and the roots of colonization and how that has impacted us and our power. And I think that's really important that we have a historical approach, because when we have that, we begin to understand how we feel, what happens with our insecurity or our confidence issues, and a lot of fears that I know women in leadership roles still carry because of historical oppressions. And I think we also need to highlight the violence against the earth is completely connected towards violence against women. Those two things are very intermarried in this patriarchal structure that we're operating in, and understand that this sense of dominion over women, dominion over nature, is an injustice. So those things are all very connected for me. And I just want to tell a quick story and then show a short video, because I think it will be really inspiring for people to see how some of the incredible Indigenous leaders we're working with have really woven a lot of these topics of nature and justice and gender identity into how we can address this moment. I don't want to show the video quite yet. I just wanted to tell a quick story first. So pardon me, I didn't mean to cue you up so fast. Just a short story, and then we'll go to the video. I was reminded of something while I was here at the climate talks, a very powerful press conference that happened in one of the climate talks that was delivered by Indigenous people who had gathered for a time to talk about calling for Indigenous rights and free, prior, informed consent and Indigenous rights in these international spaces. And there's a very powerful woman from the community of Chiricahua in Ecuador, from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and her name is Ana Santi. And I'll never forget how she stood up in this room of, sort of very conservative journalists and reporters reporting on Indigenous peoples at the COP. And she said, and she just looked at everybody and spoke with such eloquence and said, "We women, we can do anything. It's about women's power. This is our time as women. And we women, we can carry babies on our back. We carry babies on our back through the jungle at night. We can do anything. And we are descendants of the jaguars. We can do anything." And she just really infuses power to all the women in the room, wanted just about our strength, and then also how we're connected to nature, and remembering that we are descendants from the plants and animals, ecologically as well as historically. And so I just wanted to bring her voice here, because I'll never forget her saying, "Remember, you are descendants of the jaguar. You are descendants of nature." So with that, let's go ahead and watch the short video of some really incredible leaders and their relationship to justice, nature, and gender.
At the end of the Mississippi River, there is a place, the Shada, called Bolbuncha, place of many tongues, a place of many languages, known better as the global port city colonizers rebranded as New Orleans, where a crossroads of waterways provides access to sites of sacred trade, stewarded by the ancestors of these lands and waters. Generations have been weathering discrimination, land grabs, hurricanes, oil spill disasters, and the catastrophic side effects of man's manipulations, flooding our ways of life. Our intertribal alliance, Oklahina Ikish Holo, People of the Sacred Medicine Trail, is working to reestablish old trade routes and networks, adapting and co-designing paths for tradeways for the future, ways to exchange medicine, food, and skills to support biodiversity and sovereignty.
This is a really exciting project that is rising up like a shining light out of one of the most polluted areas in all of Turtle Island, of all of the United States, an area that has been called Cancer Alley because of how much fossil fuel pollution is in this part of the United States, and instead show a place of regeneration and healing led by Indigenous farmers who are building community, sharing stories of the land that are lifting up a very different vision of how we can move forward in this time of great transformation where we have a need to be able to live with each other in the land in a very different way.
We believe that it is crucial for us to protect and reclaim our relationships with our sacred homelands and waters in order to restore the natural balance, so the intelligence of the system can be respected for our communities to survive in deep collaboration with the nature, like our grandmothers before us. Preparing for the unknown by putting our hands in the ground and our hearts into the work needed to strengthen decentralized systems of support, from mutual aid to intentional investment in building circular economies.
I think as we look at the multiple crises of the climate crisis and environmental degradation and colonization and environmental racism, that one of the most important things that we could be doing is to really support food sovereignty programs and food security, a way to really ensure cultural survival and cultural practices as we see storytelling taking place, and the story of the seeds and the story of the communities and all these different peoples that came together on these trade routes. When we talk about what we're going to do about the climate crisis, what are we going to do about colonization, what are we going to do about respecting Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights, this is a response.
Our gardeners are on a journey together, collectively learning and sharing skills, hosting workshops on a spectrum of topics from composting to multimedia storytelling to medicine making, seed harvesting, and more. The Oklahina Ikish Holo network of gardens connect us to each other, to traditional territories, to the places we call home, to the earth, and to the planetary work that is so urgently needed. But we know the plants carry the lessons to help us face the intersectional toxic challenges of injustices tied to colonial practices, perpetuated by multinational petrochemical corporations fueling the climate crisis. We are Uma, Shata, Osage, Lakota, Muskogee, Eastern Siouan, Sichungu Lakota, and Creole, femme and non-binary gardeners, seeding and growing and building across the Gulf South to defend and protect and to restore our lands and waters in the Mississippi River Delta and within the ancestral territories of the Shata and Muskogee.
And it's one of the ways that we begin to really honor the call from Indigenous peoples for land back, for rematriation of the land. And the dream of this project is a seventh generation project that will go on for many, many generations.
That was beautiful, Osprey. Is there anything you want to say in the aftermath of that?
Thank you so much for letting me share the video. I wanted just to share that uplifting note of the community that we can build together. And as we navigate, this time, we're going to need to be in community with women and our Two-Spirit sisters around the world. And I find great hope in what we're building, and to not let the doomsday that can easily seep in all around us, which is real, to take us away from keeping our vision clear about the beauty making that we can do together as sisters and as Two-Spirit people together collectively in community. I just want people to know that we can find our way through, and we have community with one another. And I'll leave it at that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Amisha, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. It's a real honor and joy to be here with you all. Osprey, I remember listening to you on a panel in California, Bioneers 2019. And so it's really sweet that we are here all together, and to everyone that's joining us from all over the world. When I was Naelyn's age, actually, I was working in politics, and I had spent time working in DC for a US congressman and on the Kerry campaign. And then in 2004, when Bush got re-elected. And then I was in the UK, in London. I was working for an MP, and we had a general election that year as well. And there's a big drinking culture in England, and especially in British politics. And in the Houses of Parliament, the alcohol is heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. So it adds to that culture even more. And one night, I was sitting with lots of the young researchers and assistants, and we were drinking, talking about things from our day. And I was sharing something from my heart about some issue, who knows which one it was. And somebody turned to me and looked me in the eyes and said, "Amisha, do you know what your problem is?" And I was like, "Go on then, tell me what my problem is." And he said, "You're never going to make it very far in politics, because the problem is that you care too much about people." And that was a real moment for me, where I kind of looked at where I was, and I thought that I had gone to this place where I could tap into my desire for these aspects of nature, women's leadership, and justice, and in fact realized that that wasn't the place for me. And that's not true for everyone, because I really do commend those women, and also just those that are more in their feminine, that are able to be in those particular spaces and push things forward. I realized for me that wasn't going to be where I was going to be able to exert and discover and really ground my own leadership. And so I went on a journey to do things myself, and to do them without following the rules, and often working in areas that I didn't really know anyone that was doing what I was doing. And this experience allowed me to really tap in. So that led me into different journeys through setting up an ethical jewelry label, learning about you know how this could be, and kind of the language before the sustainable fashion movement had come together. And then I was very much part of that, because I saw it as something that really tapped into these issues from both sides of the coin. On one side, those that had become so heavily obsessed with buying things, and that breakdown of our own worth that these systems of oppression have brought into culture. There are, it's just insane, the amount of clothes that are produced and what's happening to them, and the women that are making them, and the impact to the environment through all of that. And then on the other side, of course, the rights of those that are working, and and all of the materials and the landfill. And so I worked in that area for a really long time, and somewhere alongside that developed what became The Future is Beautiful. It started off being called Think, Act, Vote, and it was in 2010 when we had a general election in the UK, and I was thinking, we can no longer trust, and I don't know if anyone ever could, but I know that I grew up believing that that's what politics was for, that there was a sense that you could vote for a party that had the vision of the future that you choose, the world that you want to live in, and that they would create that. And I realized, okay, well, that's not what happens in this world, and that's definitely not where we're going. And so each one of us has to be so tuned in to our own vision and our own sense of possibility and of what could happen, and our own reading and understanding of what is happening that might be different from the conditioning that we've been receiving from these different systems of oppression. And so for me, that's been a huge motivator, like a driving force from the heart and from the inside, to ask different questions and to explore things in a different way than I ever experienced them myself. And just on this theme, I feel like something that I've been thinking about a lot recently really encapsulates it, which is that I was at an online event that Lila June Johnson was speaking at recently, and she said something about how a war isn't won until the women are on the ground, or until the women's hearts are broken. And that's often why rape and all of these other weapons are used in war, because actually, it's known how strong the women are and how much they hold and carry and protect and nurture, and how much they can withstand in order to protect the earth and those that they love. And so it's known that, it's once you can really, really break that's when, when whatever you want to take can be taken. And I say that because it just reminds me of that power that those of us that are inside bodies that identify as female hold. And one thing that I've been really thinking about as I've just come back to London, and I've just spent a year living in a small village where I've had the freedom to go out late at night and be under the night sky by myself and be really, really safe, be able to just walk and contemplate. And I've been feeling like, as we're such lunar beings, all of us humans, that we've had this taken away from us as women. Where I am right now, there is no way that I'm safe to go and walk around and look up at the sky and not be watching my back late at night, or even, it's getting dark now at 5 p.m. And so I have a question of what would happen if all women were safe to be out and receive the messages and the guidance from nature that the night sky brings. And what have we lost from society from that not being the case?
That's a great question, Amisha. And as I listened to both of you, and Osprey, I was so moved by what you shared about Anasanti and what she said, and women as being descendant of the jaguar. And Amisha, as you invoked, women's fierce protective nature. I keep thinking about how a woman protecting a child or her family is not going to pull back and doesn't stop, right? I mean, you don't get tired and stop. That's not the nature of women. And that feels like a key to why women and nature and justice is such a powerful combination right now. And for transparency, Naelyn, I hope you won't mind if I say this. I was going to ask Naelyn to speak first because I tend to honor the youth first, but in her culture, she's more comfortable going last. So Naelyn, I'd love to hear what you feel like sharing around this.
Yeah, well, first, Sean, thank you. It's really nice to hear a lot of powerful speaking coming all the way around these discussions. And here in Arizona, I'm Chiricahua Apache, and I am a descendant of prisoners of war who now, where I live, is on the San Carlos Reservation, which is southeast of Arizona. And in my short time being here on this earth, I feel like now Indigenous people have to kind of learn quick, especially our young people um, of all different ethnic groups, because we're at such a critical time. We're at a time of urgency where we're not having to learn the natural cycle of how we should be here on the earth. It's like we're kind of all this information is being crammed onto us because if we don't learn this and if we don't carry this, then we are not going to have a future. And so I kind of come from that generation where we're learning so much, and we're kind of having to understand that if we don't do anything now, then our children will live in a world that's worse than it is now. And to me, that kind of gives me hope, though, that there is change, that we can create change, and that our young people have the ability to follow the footsteps of people like you who believe in the earth and who believe in our power as females. And so on what you said about politics, as Indigenous people, we know that from the very beginning of when the United States was created, was off of the murder and genocide of our people. So anything from policies and laws and treaties and political leaders in general, when we talk about putting our hopes into them, it's already known that it's a failure. You know, we can't put our hopes into politicians because it's the people who make the change. And we are named Apache, named that by the Spanish, but our language, our name is Inne, which means the people. And a lot of Indigenous tribes in the United States, their name represents the people. And so being a young girl learning this generational fight of what it means to be Apache and preserving our rights by preserving the land, I've got to learn that we are the land as human beings. And so that's what I take when I watch the video, when I hear everyone speak about nature and being a woman. I know that as human beings that we are the land, that our essence of who we are and the way that we breathe connects to the land. And I believe that we as Indigenous people are the best stewards of the land because we know how to take care of it, especially here within the United States, because we are the last people to be colonized. And that's why so many people look to Indigenous people for a pathway, because people who are not from the United States or not Indigenous, they've been colonized. Their people have already been colonized, and we have to recognize that history. But once we recognize that history and we go to the people who can take care of the land and know how to do that, then that's when real change can be created. Because in that video, it shows that Native women connect themselves to the land. And in an Apache way of life, we have a coming of age ceremony or a sunrise ceremony, which it literally explains the symbolism of our creation story and how women give life. And it's really hard to understand that the patriarchy, that oppresses women, because in Apache way of life, we're not like that. There's a balance between men and women and nature. So when I hear about, listening to this discussion, it's almost new to me because I come from a people who believe in the balance of Nagosan, the earth. And so it saddens me because I know that when I had my first menstrual, when I was 12. My whole family and community and friends came to my sunrise ceremony, my coming of age ceremony, to celebrate my ability to give life and my ability to be reborn just as our creation story. And so that is something I am very honored and blessed to have. And that's why these fights, when we talk about fighting for sacred sites in the earth, we have to, because these creation stories will be gone. These ceremonies will be gone because we know it benefits the earth. What we see here on the physical plane in these ceremonies connect us to things that we are unable to see. We used to once see it, but we no longer don't because of where we are at as human beings. And so when we talk about wanting to fight for Mother Earth and wanting to preserve her, we're really talking about preserving our own lives. We're talking about fighting for humanity and fighting for us to survive, because Indigenous people believe that she can renew herself. She has the power and the strength to create us and nurture us as human beings. She also has the power to take us away for hurting her too much. And so when we talk about climate change, we're talking about our own survival as human beings.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm so grateful, Naelyn, that you had that kind of sunrise ceremony. And I can't help but wonder, what if more women around the world had the privilege of having ceremonies like that as they came into adulthood, instead of being raised with shame and embarrassment about coming into womanhood. And, you know, as I listen to you all, I'm noticing that Bill McKibben, I heard Bill McKibben recently acknowledge that the most powerful climate justice leaders around the world of all backgrounds, he said, the vast majority are women. And he said, I'm not sure why that is. He said, maybe it's because women have an easier time facing into a difficult situation. And I thought about that and I thought, well, that's interesting as a hypothesis. But I wonder, because each of you in your own way are spiritually motivated warriors for justice and love and nature, I wonder what you think about that and why you think it is that so many women are called into leadership in this time and are so powerfully sort of showing us the way. Osprey, if you feel like going first, feel free, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do so. What do you think, Osprey?
Sure, I'll jump in if that's all right with the others. That's fine. It was beautiful to hear from both of you. It really touched my heart to hear both of you. And yeah, I think that to go to your question, Nina, and also tie in a little bit of what Naelyn said, is that I think it's also a lot to do with imbalances. So we've not been hearing from women because of institutionalized patriarchy for thousands of years, which is very tied into colonization, which is very tied into capitalism, as we've talked about, and racism as well. And so I think part of it is that when there's an imbalance, when you begin to hear the voice that has not been heard before, it begins to balance our human condition. And we have not been hearing from women. And so when we hear from them, we hear a truth. And we know that they've had to face, due to unequal gender norms, incredible hardships to varying degrees, depending on which countries they live in. It's certainly not even everywhere. But I think this is also true of Indigenous peoples and Black and Brown peoples. People who have been oppressed have had to struggle to survive. And that struggle has also provided, us as women, Indigenous people in their way, Black and Latina women in their way. I can only speak from my own background. That struggle has informed us as to what the imbalances are, where the pressure points are, where the challenge is, where is that nexus, because we're trying to survive and struggle our way through. So I think part of it is that it is time to hear from and learn from all the unseen, all the unspoken, all the unheard voices. And that includes the voice of Mother Earth, the voice of nature. So the more that we hear from all the silent ones, those that have been oppressed, the more we can bring balance to the system. And I think that's what's happening. It's the time of women rising. It is the time of women rising. We have been under the thumb of patriarchy all over the world, and it has been to the great demise of humanity. And it's clearly not working. And so I think that, as women enter every sphere, there is going to be and is a transformation. And I would also note, it's not just about having more women bodies in the room. It's a worldview. It's an analysis. It's an understanding of long histories of the goddess, of understanding long histories of these ceremonies that Naelyn was talking about. It's a long history of a connection with nature that's not better than men's connection with nature. It's just what's been missing. And it turns out we really need it. And so I think as we look to this time of women rising, it's because Mother Earth is calling out for her women. Mother Earth is calling out for the sisterhood. Mother Earth is calling out for this balance. And that at the same time, it's really important to know that, we need to support the unique voice of women in the sense of the systems change that we're calling for. So yes, we want, 50-50 balance, let's say, in our halls of power, so to speak, in political spheres and in business and all these different spheres that we operate in. But it's not enough to have the women in the room. We also need to ensure that Indigenous, Black, and Brown and frontline women's voices are heard, disability women, women who have special needs. We need to ensure that we stay balanced even as we're in this transition, because what we don't want is a repeat of, as they call the first or second wave of feminism, so to speak, in which white women really directed the movement. That needs to be just deconstructed. This is a time where we really need Indigenous, Black, and Brown women to lead. That's also an imbalance that needs to be healed, that we're looking from a gendered and racial lens as we head into this time of lifting up women's leadership in a new way. So I think that's really important to make that distinction. I just wanted to bring up one last final point and then hand this floor back to you, Nina, is that earlier this year, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, we put out a report called The Gendered and Racial Impacts of the Fossil Fuel Industry in North America. And people are welcome to see that online. And I mention it because I think it's really important that as we speak out as women, that we bring in a racial lens. And so we wanted to show the specific impacts of this industry on women, but that really meant we had to have a gendered lens to really demonstrate really fully what that impact is, and the incredible voices and strength of women from the front lines, from Indigenous communities, from Black communities, from Latinx communities. So I really wanted to lift up those voices, which is what we did. We interviewed a lot of those women in that report. And to also, reflect back on what Naelyn said about, this time of Indigenous people. I think one of the things we can do is, if you don't know who the Indigenous people are of the land where you live, please go and learn the names of those peoples that live there and learn of their struggles and lift them up. Especially here in the United States of America, but wherever you live, I have learned so much, almost everything I know from Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous women. And if we're going to really navigate this very complex time, the people who know the land well and how to live in these governance systems that are balanced, it's time for us to step back and lift up Indigenous peoples. And that also means fighting for their rights, the Indigenous rights. It's not just about going and asking and saying, please help me. No. The reverse. How can we support Indigenous peoples in land back? How can we support Indigenous peoples in their fight to protect their territories, their water and forests. It's a time of listening and learning to Indigenous women. I think it's one of the highest and most potentiated acts that we can do all over the world, is to listen to Indigenous women's leadership, support them in their struggles for their rights, and be humble listeners.
Thank you, Osprey. Thank you for bringing in the full intersectionality of what we're facing, and also for removing it from a purely gendered question, because I think it's bigger than that. Amisha or Naelyn? And Naelyn, when next you speak, there's a question here. Can you please unmute your mic? Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
I can add in there that I also doubt that it's true that, you know, women weren't doing all this before, and that part of it is just like what people can see now, and because of the way that things are with social media and such like, there aren't the same gatekeepers there to, you know, who gets to speak on a stage about climate and climate justice. Traditionally, it's been a lot of older white men. I know that, you know, I spent a huge amount of time listening to older white men talk about climate, and I've heard a lot of intellectualizing around these issues, and I know that underneath all of that, there's always been a huge amount of movement happening and actual organizing and activism that's going on. And it feels like this is just a time where more of that, there is more space, because there's also been a cultural shift in awareness around, as Osprey said, both women and race. And because of tools like social media, it does mean that anyone can have a voice and start to speak, and that then people can choose what resonates with them. There's still complications like shadow banning, where women of color have their posts seen by far less people, and they often have their posts censored more. But it just feels like there's, you know, it's like we can't go on the way that we've been going on. And I feel like COP26 is really showing that. On one hand, you've got all of these men looking like they're falling asleep, like on their chairs, and the prime minister of this country going off on a private jet to have dinner with a climate denier straight after COP, during COP. But then you've got all of these young activists. There are so many women there. And I saw this beautiful picture of like old leadership, and it was all men in suits, and then new leadership, and it was all young women. And there was, you know, Indigenous women in their headdresses. There were women wearing bright colors. And it was just like, yeah, like we don't have time for that anymore. We don't have time to wait for anyone to invite us in. Like, we're just going to get on with it as we always have been, but we're getting louder, and we are also being given more of a platform.
Thank you. Thank you, Amisha. Naelyn, love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, well, I really think that we have come to a time where we're saying enough is enough, whether it's for women or for just Indigenous people in general. I think that we've come to a time where the oppression is putting us into a corner, and it's telling us either we stand up or we go. We don't survive. And so I think it's the critical time that we are at right now. And when I think about strength in women, I think about my great-grandmother, Elvira Nosey, and she was our roots. She was our tree, and we are the fruit from her. And that comes to my maternal mother's father, which is my grandfather, Wentzler Nosey, who's the founder of the Apache Stronghold. He was born from my great-grandmother, Elvira. And when we would look at her strength, that really paved the path of our family. And it showed us that we needed to carry that same strength as her. And so in Apache way of life, we are born on our mother's side, meaning that we are raised by our mother and her family. And so I take a lot of those teachings from my mom. And so when I think and I hear about strength in women, I think about the women in my life, which is my mother, my great-grandmother, my grandmas, and my aunts, because to me, they've showed myself about what it means to be a woman and how powerful I can be, because we literally can carry life. We can carry and give life to a being. And that in itself is strength that we can't and no one can understand but those who can. And so, and I have yet to even know that power because I don't have children for myself, but I see the strength in my past generations and within my people and how respected they are by the men in our community. Like, I see how much my grandfather respected his mother and how much he wanted to fight for us, for my sisters, for my cousins who are girls, for my mom, and his daughters. And we need more people who recognize that kind of balance and allow us that kind of power when it means protecting us. And so I feel that I'm very blessed to come from a family like that and to come from a grandfather who wants to protect us, who recognizes that we are the givers of life, and he shows that. And in this fight with the Apache stronghold, we're talking about a foreign mining company called Resolution Copper, who got all federal laws bypassed through the National Defense Bill in 2014 to extract copper ore from our sacred area, which is Oak Flat. And this has been happening since before I was born. And so being born, I tell all the Indigenous youth that when we first started fighting was when we were out of the womb. When we took our very first breath as Indigenous people, that is when our fight begins. Because especially by governments, we are supposed to be an exterminated people, a people not existing in this world anymore. But when we are born, we're reminding these governments that they failed, that their strategy to make our people extinct failed. And that is power within itself. And so when Indigenous mothers give life to Indigenous babies, it is telling the patriarchy and telling these government policies and laws and systems that they need to watch out. And so I feel empowered by that within itself. And I think that's why, we are leading these movements, because we see that power, we recognize it, but we don't misuse it. Once we start to misuse these kind of things, then we too are putting an imbalance out there. So we have to be able to respect it and to understand it. And that's why we talk about, we all have a role, and even in this discussion, our stories are being told. We're telling each other our stories of our life and our experiences, but there's so many people in this world who don't get their stories told, and once these stories are told and accepted by all people, then real change can happen. And I really believe that. And so even little discussions like what we're having now, we're being heard, not just here from us as human beings, but by the earth. And I truly believe that.
Naelyn, thank you so much. You have such a wise perspective, and I couldn't agree more. And we're starting to get some questions in the chat. So I want to encourage anyone who's got questions bubbling up to put them into the chat. Though I also know that we're going to be short on time to answer them all. I want to share a little quick story that makes me wonder what each of your perspectives are on this, which is that a few years ago, there was a time where I kept getting bitten by a brown recluse spider on the front of my shin. And I went to an Indigenous woman who is one of my teachers, and I asked her to help me understand what grandmother spider was trying to tell me. And she journeyed and she came back and she said, Grandmother Spider wants you to understand that you need to stop meeting conflict only from your masculine side and increasingly practice meeting conflict from your feminine side. So this really speaks to something that Osprey was bringing up, and I think you've all mentioned in different ways, that as human beings, we all have masculine and feminine within us. And I think we're all trying to recover from some inherited definitions of what those gendered qualities are that are not necessarily true. But at the time, I said, can you please tell me a little more about that? What do you mean? And she said, well, you know, the masculine meets conflict with force and aggression and raw power. And the feminine meets conflict very differently. She said, think of how a river cuts through a canyon or grass grows through the concrete. The feminine tends to meet conflict, she said, with gentle, persevering pressure that's flexible but persevering. And I thought that was very powerful. So I'm curious about your own experiences, just briefly, if anything comes up, about whether you think part of what may be strengthening the women in leadership so much is an orientation to meet conflict in a different way. What do you think?
All right, well, I guess we'll just sort of, unless someone else wants to jump in, such precious time, I don't want to.
Yeah, thank you, Osprey.
Go for it. About that. You know, it's really interesting because I feel that these definitions have such nuances, and we humans are such funny critters, especially in our modern world. And you know, the idea of needing to sort of identify things in a very binary way too. I think that there's so much more nuance and complexity. So as an example, when I think of myself and conflict, as you were bringing up, you know, I see also in women the mama bear, as you were sort of talking about earlier, Nina, you know, that, you know, how women as mothers, we can become very ferocious if our children are under attack. And so is that feminine or masculine? So I think it's more, again, about balance. So how we deal with conflict and view like seventh generation thinking and how we approach conflict. To me, it's not so much that we don't have like an assertive nature that isn't really important, but how we do that might be very different. I know for me, you know, just to take, you know, example close to home, I'm here at the COP, and you know, I feel like every time I go into that space, and the negotiations are still going on. In fact, one of the things that are being negotiated right now as we speak is about human rights, indigenous rights, in one of these key articles. And it's been just heartbreaking and enraging at the same time that there's a discussion about removing language around human rights and indigenous rights around Article 6, which I won't go wonky into all of that. But, you know, just that there's people fighting for us to not have human rights. Okay, so this brings forward the warrioress in me. So I'm fighting, but it's also from a very tender place of my love for humanity, my love for future generations. So I just have to say, I get a little bit confused in these conversations because I feel like we are a warrioress and we're healer, and they move fluidly depending on what's happening. And that when I'm being the warrioress to fight the corporations where we do our divestment delegations, or I went and spoke to Parliament here, spoke to parliamentarians, I was very forceful, but in my heart, I was very soft. I was very tender. I was very polite with them, even though I was very confrontative in what I said and provocative. But it was because of love. It's because of my love for Mother Earth, my love for our human family, my love for future generations and the children. So yes, they felt the warrioress, but behind that is this deep love and this dedication and this passion. And the fire is coming because of this great warmth of love. So I I sort of see us bringing this fluidness between the warrioress and the healer. And maybe that's very unique how we do that as women.
Thank you so much. Beautifully said. Amisha.
I love everything that's being shared by everyone, because there's so many dimensions to it all, and I feel like that's what I want to add, that I feel like we're able to meet reality and like what needs to be done in the same way that maybe we do in the home, and that there are just things that need to be done, plates that need to be washed, meals that need to be cooked, and it doesn't really matter if you're tired. Like, it just has to happen because there are people that need feeding. And so we just get on with things, and yet also are powered by the unseen, where we have this deep rooted intuition. We have our ancestors behind us. We have the future generations in front of us. And I feel like without even needing to consciously connect to that's always there. And it allows this kind of practicality, as well as a soft and strong heart and thick skin, and, kind of unknown amounts of energy that are sort of able to be generated as and when they're needed to. And I feel like we do get tired within all of that, but that's why we need each other to lift each other up and to encourage each other to rest sometimes, and that someone else can take it for the next bit. And I feel like that's something that we need to invite in more, and that we need to invite in more of the support as well, from those in male identified bodies, to recognize like how support can be, so that energy, that really precious energy and vision, and like the patience, as well as the warrior like goddess power, can be honored.
Beautiful. Naelyn, my friend.
I guess I would just like to tell a quick story. So currently right now with the Save Oak Flat movement, we had filed a lawsuit against the United States and Tonto National Forest for violating our First Amendment right by violating the land. And so it got put in a district court, but of course, in this system, we don't win. So it got denied. Well, we appealed, and we were recently at the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco. And when we were there, we were with our lawyers, the Beckett Fund, our attorney, and the Apache Stronghold as the plaintiff against the United States. And so the U.S. attorney, what she had stated, and and when I first think about fighting people when it comes to desecration of sacred land, I would always think it's usually male dominated. But we had a female U.S. attorney. And to me, when I see that, it saddens me even more so, because we have such a strong connection to the land. And so she explained, and her statement was that land and religion are not the same, and they're not recognized together. And so in indigenous way of life, we cannot, and just as human beings, we cannot take away the two. There's no way of dividing it. It's entwined. And you see that in indigenous way of life because it is in our language, it is in our song, it is in our medicine, in our way of life, in our history. We as human beings, when we pass on, we go back into the land. And so when we talk about this, I had so much rage, you're hurt by this because you're told not only that because even before, so the U.S. attorney told us that we're still, as Native people, prisoners of war. So when it comes to the land and our religion, it can be taken away at any time, especially those who live on the reservation, because we don't have the same rights to other citizens in the United States. And this is all talked about now. Like she just said it about a couple weeks ago. And so in this, I want people to know is that this fight is still very current. You know, we talk about what Indigenous people are going through and how we have to battle this patriarchy and these systems of oppression right here and now, are like this with the Oak Flat fight. We need to support, you know. And my first thing I did throughout the whole court and the hearing was prayer. And so for me, when we talk about spirituality and our way of fight and how we can fight those at different angles, I did that through prayer, you know. And all I could do is pray for her, and that she is forgiven, and that she can finally see or open her eyes and her heart and her spirit to what is actually out there, you know. And so that's my piece.
Thank you so much for that, Naelyn. And several of you have really powerfully illustrated how being connected to the invisible world and to the mother are tremendous sources of strength in meeting conflict. Oh boy. Okay, so we have a lot of questions and very little time. So I'm going to read the questions and invite your reflections and offer that I hope we can continue this somehow beyond this. And so I'm going to invite you to respond in the same sequence we have and just speak to whatever within 2 or 3 minutes you can about these questions. So Laura Hill is asking, what does feminine leadership look like in our Bioneers community? I think we can see it right here, but there's lots more examples. Tamara Swift is asking, how do we rebuild matriarchy? Which is a great question. They're all great questions. Sunny wants to know what meeting conflict from the feminine side looks like, which I think each of us has modeled in different ways, but we'll see what comes up. And Catherine has a question for Osprey, which is there any precautionary thinking regarding unintended consequences during this transitional time at COP26? So with that, to you, Osprey.
Beautiful questions and beautiful panel. Thank you, Nina, for bringing us together. And I'll just start by also saying this is really healing for me, just to have this conversation. I have been in a battle zone for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That is not this space of women coming together and having different views and exploring ideas. So I'm sort of picking up on the last question that was presented about precautionary principle and what is women's role there, trying to sort of weave in some of the different questions together. And, you know, we have to remember that mostly what's happening in these big government meetings like the COP and, you know, and certainly not just even here at the COP, but because our governments are based on colonialism and patriarchy and racism and capitalism, as we've been talking about, you know, their goal is not to do what we want them to do, which is to preserve the future, preserve ecosystems, care for frontline communities. They're here to ensure that their corporations and that the wealth of wealthy countries continues. That's what they're here for. They're here to have a trade show. They're here to ensure that any kind of agreements that are made doesn't do anything to harm their pocketbook or shut down the fossil fuel industry or harm any streams of income, and to maintain these systems, even though they are killing us. They're literally killing us. So I think the reason we're trying to bring a feminist lens, an Indigenous lens to the space is because we need to dismantle the system. It's not working. And so, no, the last thing on their mind is precaution or seventh generation. They're here to ensure business as usual and to drive this point home. And we're here to disrupt that. We're not here to help them. We're here to disrupt them. Yeah. And so I would leave it at that. So there's time for everyone else to speak, but that's where we need to speak out. And that's why we're here.
Yeah. Thank you, Osprey. Amisha.
I'm so inspired hearing Naelyn and like your experiences of just growing up with the level of wisdom and support around you. And I know for many of us, we did not have that, and we do not have that. And so we find it in communities like this. And these are the places that we come to grow and to decolonize. And for me, in my specific example, like I grew up in the belly of my beast, right? All my living ancestors had been colonized by the country in which I ended up being born. And so I have had to navigate these two worlds and realize that I had been indoctrinated into the system that colonized my family. And it's like a very complicated thing to unpack, as well as the Indian notions of patriarchy. And so I'd say a huge part of my personal journey of leadership has been to do that inner work so that I can understand how these systems of oppression have directly impacted the way in which I see the world, the way in which I think, and the way in which I act, and especially the ways in which I've held myself back from the truth of my soul and what it is that I've come to offer into this world. And so in answer to that question of like, how does feminine leadership show up? How can we find it within these spaces? Like, we have to do that work, and we have to understand the ways in which we have been implicit in all of these systems, and that we are implicit in these systems, and to really allow ourselves to move from that deeper space within us and not wait for anyone's permission to do so. And also really support those that we see that are, and give space and platforms to those that understand this, and so that we can all like move through this much deeper and much faster, because we've got so much to do in you know, the clock's ticking. The clock's always been ticking, and it just seems like it's ticking more and more as time, you know, as we move through time, and we're seeing some of the same conversations happening in mainstream spaces. And so yeah, the time is now, and we have to do it.
Yeah.
It's really good to hear, you know, from all of you. And I think that one, like, I guess I could go for the rebuilding the matriarchy is to give that power back to the earth. You know, let her do her job. Once we let her do her thing, then everything in every different angle we can heal as human beings, and let the rightful stewards of the land protect it. Because if the rightful people are not protecting the land, then we're not going to be able to heal her in the right way. And when I talk about stewards of the land, it's mainly reaching to Indigenous people, but the work will not be able to be done, and the goal will not be able to be reached without everyone together as human beings. I think too often we kind of put names on things, and we put claim on certain things, and we cannot do that no more, because the victim and the one who gets hurt the most is our youth and the earth. And so it really needs to take all of us together to take that kind of stand, and it's never too late. Don't ever think it's too late to stand up now or to take part in something, because these safe spaces are here for you, you know. And so I hope that this encourages everyone to do the right thing, because if you don't, then you become a bystander. And once that continues to happen, then there's no future.
Yeah.
Because that's what's at stake right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Naelyn. Beautifully said. And, you know, the one thing that I would add as we close, and I'm sorry we're out of time, we could go on much, much longer, is that I do believe that part of how women in the Bioneers community lead, and people lead from the heart, is together and in collaboration. And it's my experience that perhaps the greatest untapped resource we have as women finding our way into leadership is the capacity we have to support and strengthen and grow each other, and to really have each other's backs, because many of us have been culturally trained to compete with each other, when in fact, what the earth needs from us is our collaboration. And so thank you each for your beautiful words, your presence, Thank you, everybody who's joining us. And here's to women plus women leading plus justice plus nature. Together, let us serve the Great Mother and ourselves to a future that works for all. And thank you so, so much, everybody. Big love.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.